Hello and welcome to a Wilson Center Polar Institute special event on the Arctic and U.S. national security. Hi, I'm John Molesky, your host for this series, and my co-host is Mike Sfraga. Mike is director of the Wilson Center's Global Risk and Resilience Program and its Polar Institute. Mike, welcome back.
Thank you, John.
You've been here for all four parts, and now we come to our grand finale, fittingly titled Charting a Path Forward.
Correct. We've had multiple programs, all looking at the future Arctic. This panel looks at charting that path forward. So really, it's insights by Admiral Zukunft, Sherry Goodman, Jim Townsend, and General Church Key from Alaska. And really, what they've done is they're looking at responding to all that they have heard throughout the program, and thinking about ways in which you can leverage the expertise, the operations, the paths, the strategies. How can the United States best operate in this environment by leveraging expertise? But also, how do you operationalize that? How do you institutionalize these kind of strategies and perspectives so that there's a coordinated effort for the United States in a changing Arctic at a time when Arctic security is becoming more and more important?
Mike, is there a timeline for this type of coordination?
Not yet. However, I think that because Senator Murkowski, Senator Sullivan, and their colleagues in the Senate and in the House, both House and Senate have seen an emerged Arctic, not an emerging Arctic, that this is becoming more important. So all of these programs, like the ones we're doing here at the Wilson Center, and the efforts going on that we've heard throughout the day and throughout the other segments, all of those actually do build a momentum behind not just discussions like we're having. These discussions are now happening all over Washington, D.C., and hopefully this will push the issue that you do need some whole-of-government approach to the Arctic.
And our GCI audience, those of you out there in Alaska, you are, as Mike said in a previous episode, at the tip of the spear. So enjoy this segment, and Mike and I will be back in a moment.
I'm going to give you 5 not justs. That's going to capture, I think, of what some of us were saying this morning. The first not just is this. What we're seeing in the Arctic in terms of security and defense is not just a U.S. problem. And I think we really need to understand that more fully. My work in the Arctic has been on the European Arctic, which is also a U.S. Arctic issue too because of NATO. I mean, many times in Washington, when you talk to someone about the Arctic, we immediately start talking about either icebreakers or Alaska or both, which is great, and it's great for me too because I'm learning a new part of the Arctic. But I can tell you that for 20 years or so, I've been working that European Arctic where NATO is a big player there, and Norway's a big player, and the United States is a big player, and we've got a lot of understanding there that is useful when you look at the Arctic issues over in Alaska. But I think especially important is to understand that with NATO comes allies, including Canada, that will help us work on these things. So the not just here is it's not just a U.S. issue, security and defense in the Arctic. There's a lot of us involved in this. The second thing is it's not just an Alaska problem, and it kind of goes back to what I was just saying. In Washington, you know, I'm always the Europe guy saying, don't forget there's this part of it too, and we're linked into it because of NATO. So it's not just Alaska, there's this European aspect of it too. And so thinking of the Arctic, as we had said earlier, that stretches from the Bering Strait across Canada, Greenland, GI-UK gap, North, that's one whole theater of operations, if you will. And having that holistic look is helpful. Number 3, it's not just a PACOM problem, or Indo-PACOM, I guess as it's called now. I say that because when we were in Alaska at our conference up there, PACOM was heavily represented there, and you could see that they were wringing their hands over how do we operate, how does the Pacific Navy, if you will, operate up in Alaska, the problems up there, the need to get to understand that operating environment. And I'm talking about the navies here, not the Coast Guard, by the way. This is all oriented that way. So it's not just a PACOM problem. It's operating in the Arctic is a EUCOM problem too. NAVIR, NATO's MARCOM. You talk about Second Fleet, which is now stood up in Norfolk, that has an Arctic portfolio. So I mentioned to the PACOM folks in Alaska, I said, have you talked to the guys like Admiral Fogo out of NAVIR in Naples? Have you talked to Admiral Lewis there in Norfolk standing up Second Fleet? And there didn't seem to be a lot of cross-fertilization between the Pacific Navy and the Atlantic Navy. And so I just want to make the point again that PACOM PACOM has access to a lot of people who probably know more about Arctic environment than those planners in Hawaii do, and that there should be a great cross-fertilization between them and lessons learned. And I'm sure that's happening now. But just to make that point. And before I move away from that, not just MARCOM, the Maritime Command in Northwood in the UK, which is NATO's maritime command, there's a lot of responsibility there as well as knowledge there. So just to make that point, it's not a PACOM problem. There's a lot of other military players that are involved. The fourth point, and this is not going to be real popular to say, but know my point, it's not just about icebreakers. And I say that with full love for icebreakers, knowing icebreakers are important. And we had a great discussion yesterday about icebreakers being key to a lot of things in terms of presence up there, in terms of it's the key to a lot of solutions to problems up there. You've got to have these icebreakers. It's got to be a priority. It is a priority. What I don't want to have happen is for people who don't know the nuance of all the things that we need up there is to think that if we get some icebreaker or two in the budget that, that we can go on to other things. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's other things we've got to do. We've talked about infrastructure, whether it's military or commercial or civilian infrastructure. There's a lot to be done up there. We always talk about icebreakers for good reason, and it's a priority. But it's more than that, and we can't let people off the hook if they think that once they get icebreakers in the budget, we're good to go. The last not just is it's not just a new Cold War. And again, I'm referring to Russia here. It's too easy, and I tell you, Church and I both were part of this as we were looking at post-Crimea scenarios. I mean, we worked this day and night. It was always the strain not to just go back to the old Cold War playbook in terms of handling the Russians. I mean, that was the easy thing to do. We did take some pages from the old book. We're putting forces back in. We're doing a lot of things. But it's not just a new Cold War at all for lots of different reasons, which I don't have time to go into. But I think it's important to understand that as we look now, and I'm going to talk about the European Arctic here, as we look now at how the navies might operate with dealing with the Russians up in that European Arctic area, we talked about this morning, there's an artificial intelligence / machine learning / high-tech aspect of operating up there those tools that we did not have back during the Cold War days. The Russians that we're facing up there, their submarine capabilities are not what we were facing either. And both in terms of numbers, they had many more than they do now, but in terms of quality, it's much better now than what they had. So there's a lot of aspects that make it different. And as Second Fleet begins to stand up and deal with this, if you listen to what Admiral Lewis had to say, I think he gets that, and they're now trying to pull together what does this new playbook look like for Second Fleet as they operate up there in the European Arctic. And I will say that there will be that playbook would be applicable too in a lot of ways to Alaska and the Arctic there as well. And so the last point before moving on is just that at the end of the day, it's going to be resources. And we've said that over and over and over again here. That's always the case, no matter what issues you're dealing with. At the end of the day, it becomes resources. But it became apparent to me and this morning as the question was asked about, so when are we going to see some gray hulls up around Alaska? And the response from the Navy was, well, as you know, we've got a process and a priorities, and it's not necessarily the CNO's decision and the Secretary. The problem is there's not enough resources to go around, whether it's icebreakers or just gray hulls generally. So we've got a big resource problem for the Navy. It's going to take many, many years to sort. They're going to have to decide priorities and risks and that type of thing. So at the end of the day, it's resources, and there's a great claim on it. And so we as a community here, an Arctic community, are going to have to keep the powers that be in Washington focused on this for years to come.
The U.S. has long had presence in the Arctic. We know we've been dealing for 50 years with the threat of nuclear or other missile attack from the Soviet Union, now Russia, China, and North Korea. That, in fact, is the primary reason that there's so much land-based investment going on in Alaska today. And that's important because there is a serious threat that underlies our increasing presence there. But we at the same time have, and I go back to my portfolio, which was called Environmental Security in the 1990s. You know, first and foremost, at that time, it meant cleaning up from bases we were leaving, many of them across the north. You might remember, some of you will remember, that Senator Stevens is actually the father of the Defense Environmental Restoration Program. Senator Stevens created this program in part because he wanted to see World War II sites utilized by the U.S. military cleaned up and restored for Alaskans' use. And so during the 90s and continuing on till today, that program, which I oversaw, works to sort of restore and turn back and make these sites environmentally secure for the communities in Alaska and elsewhere in the U.S. And in Europe. We did that in Europe. And at the same time, we've also learned that military-to-military environmental cooperation can help build trust and cooperation and understanding. And it can reinforce the presence that we need to have in certain regions, whether we're working with enemies, frenemies, or our true allies and partners. So I think that's, and we've utilized this sort of mill-to-mill types of cooperation in a variety of ways. And I think that as we look at the landscape we face today, where we have great power competition and still a need to be able to work with and understand who else is operating in the Arctic. Think of Shannon Jenkins' slide earlier today that showed that our presence at any particular point in time, we were just one of many dots off the Alaskan coast there with other ships in place. So we need, you know, the maritime domain awareness reinforced with that presence and that cooperation. So I want to take note of, since we're here partly as a wrap-up panel, to say what have we learned that's new and different? What's come out of today that's different? And many of you are working this as part of your daily portfolio. So let me reflect some of what I think I've heard, and I want to commend our colleagues who've come from the government today and shared with us their new and updated strategies in their work, because I think it's very significant. I took very much note that Iris Ferguson talked about the Air Force strategy. It's long been a strategic buffer, and now it's porous. And so in thinking through the Air Force with its significant presence and growing presence in the Arctic is also preparing to face those challenges. I think that's important. And also, I think what is also significant in the Navy's presentation by Jeff Barker, that he took note of the need to have, the Navy recognizes it needs long-term, it has to have a long-term view. And as I've been, and as many of you have in recent years, been watching and observing China's increasing presence in the Arctic, with its, you know, not only becoming an Arctic Council observer, but creating the Polar Silk Road, being a near Arctic state, strategic deployment of science, increased ship visits, increased collaboration, strategic collaboration, and opportunistic with Russia for resources. You know, I think it's all, and noting that China has a long-term view of its presence in the Arctic, including potentially the fish, when that Central Arctic fishing moratorium to which it signed, you know, in 16 years, and we'll all be observing how those fishing grounds, and Admiral Z talked earlier about how, you know, the fish stocks are moving northward, so at some point there may be viable fisheries in areas that are not where they are not today. So it's important that we note that we have a long-term view as well. And so I want to commend my U.S. government colleagues for that. And for the broader view, I think that integrates well the recognition that our presence in the region is changing because of Arctic environmental and climate change accelerating more rapidly. You know, the waters are warming, the sea ice is retreating, the permafrost is collapsing. And at the same time, because of our required military presence to defend against the threat, I think it also gives us a unique opportunity to innovate in this region in ways that I say we are seeing in the high north in countries whose Arctic is different than ours. I'm not Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland. You know, they face different geographic conditions, and the U.S. Arctic is a little more challenging and harsher. And at the same time, the demand for innovation, resilient infrastructure, and predictive capabilities that enable us to make sound decisions based on good data is becoming ever more apparent. But it's also, with this unprecedented risk, I think we have an unprecedented opportunity really to lead here. And so that's why I'm excited to be part of this the Wilson team, but also to really further enable our work here in this area. And I think that increasing the presence and using the presence to sort of innovate in important ways as we look to build resilient infrastructure and predictive capabilities and really further integrate our science. We've always led in the U.S. In Arctic science. I think it's going to be increasingly important that our science capabilities across the range of U.S. academic and laboratory institutions reflect the needs there. And then, of course, working closely with our allies and partners. I'm pleased that so many of our allies and partners were here today. Canada, Greenland, Finland. I'd say the others were here, at least in spirit, if not actually in presence. And as we look at kind of working with them and creating, for example, a North American Arctic construct, I think that's going to be increasingly important. And then also working with our Nordic allies, also very fundamental. And we shouldn't also forget, our other Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, also have significant capabilities in this area. So I will close by saying that as we look to sort of changing Arctic futures, we have an opportunity, I think, to harness a lot of good both intelligence as well as infrastructure and new technology capabilities, and also work closely into this new era where we'll be mindful of those changing conditions, but also in a way that brings together a whole of government capability.
Well, first of all, some of the pictures in the paper that came out on Friday would indicate the entire city of Anchorage has been leveled. And let you rest assured that is not the case. Everything's fine. We got a few roads tore up, a few buildings knocked over or knocked apart a bit, but overall, the city has come through it quite well. And in fact, last week I'd say I had two significant events. And the first one was just last Wednesday. I was walking my dog and I slipped on the ice and managed to wrap my head on the pavement pretty hard, on the ice pretty hard. And so afterwards, a little bit of reading about, so what are some of the after effects of this? They said, well, you can be either confused or confusing. So I spoke to some of my colleagues, said, well, what's new here? How do we know something's new here? And then the second piece, of course, is the biggest impact that folks, I think, had in the result of the earthquake in Anchorage was picking up glass, so and broken things. So I managed to get gloves on, and I report to you, my hands have no cuts because I wore my protective gear to get through all the broken glass cleanup from the earthquake. The third and last thing I would mention on this is that folks have learned, when you start hearing a rumble, immediately start thinking, whether I hear it here or anywhere, it's like, okay, here comes another one, because that 1,400 essentially aftershocks have come up. Most of them have been about 7 miles from my house. And so you really feel a very sharp impact, but thankfully it goes through quite quickly. And then one other piece as far as historical context. Last week's earthquake was only lasting somewhere between 45, 50 seconds, depending who you talk to on this, compared to 1964, where the earthquake there was actually more in the neighborhoods of 4.5 minutes. And so the difference between a 7.0 and a 9.4 is really that much more time to take for the city to take a beating. And it is important to Hug and Engineering Day. Is an important aspect is frankly engineering works. Having been involved with supporting Pakistan earthquake relief a number of years ago, and also the Haiti earthquake several years after that. The infrastructure that's built well, that is resilient, saves lives. So those engineers out there who are in the business of doing that, we need more of you. So please, if you're in the audience or you're on the line, please know that's important from our vantage. Strategically, a lot of things have been said today. Of course, being the last speaker is kind of a hard act to follow everybody. So I was given a task by Dr. Sfraga, and let me first of all say thank you, Mike, for the work you and the Wilson Center have done here. Superb event, and I've learned much from this. This, for me, discussion about Arctic security is a collateral duty. My normal day-to-day life as I shepherd a Center of Arctic Research, along with Dr. Larry Hinsman, our research director, and Dr. Doug Causey, our principal investigator at the University of Alaska. We're split, if you will, the Arctic Domain Awareness Center's hubs between University of Alaska Anchorage, where Dr. Causey and I are, and University of Alaska Fairbanks, where Dr. Hinsman resides. But we run a research network. It's about $3.5 million annually, funded by the Department of Homeland Security, focused on the U.S. Coast Guard Arctic mission set. So I didn't put any advertisement slides, anything like that, because I was given a task by Dr. Sfraga. I was going to answer the task, but I thought I'd take a cameo break to say that my normal day-to-day job is to shepherd research that's focused on the U.S. Coast Guard Arctic mission set. Most of this is involved with platforms, modeling, sensing type work, information systems, domain awareness technologies that are intended to help the U.S. Coast Guard be better prepared and better resilient in the conduct of their Arctic mission set. So in answering to Dr. Sfraga's question, I would offer a couple slides here. As a recovering Pentagon recidivist, I've spent a lot of cycles in and out of the building. I have to, of course, bring view graphs. So I apologize. I will not hit these in great detail, but as a pledge I make it every time I speak in an event such as this, I make my slides available for those who wish to have them. So please know if you can't see it or if it's not clear to you, please know that all you have to do is tap me on the shoulder and you'll be the lucky recipient of a bunch of slides you may or may not wish to review. So in this aspect, seeing the slides that come out on the bottom, the print, let me just say this Wilson Center, specifically Dr. Sfraga, asked me to be thought-provoking and advanced discussions that are needed now. So note, the reflections that I provide in the next few moments are not the stated positions of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, the University of Alaska, or the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So we got that on the record. But what we're going to take is a little bit of a framework. So tying it together, and as the kid who went to focus on the question that was presented to me to ask or to address by Dr. Sfraga, I've done the homework here to try to establish a framework. What are the U.S. national interests in the Arctic, borrowing from policy and strategy documents, but then to try to put in a context of a framework. So what? Who cares? What's the way forward? So in this context, oh my goodness, I think I may have pushed the button one too many times. Okay, here we go. So in this context, let me offer, this is the panoply of folks that are out there, the actors, if you will. There is a distinct community of stakeholders in the Arctic, and there are certainly non-Arctic stakeholders that are in the region. Within those communities, there's aspects between policy and governance, operators, residents, and it's important to bring the resident conversation forward. There is researchers, and research really matters in the Arctic because we don't know enough, and researchers are the folks who are going to advance our knowledge base. There is a place for industry. There's a place, unfortunately, for illicit actors. They have their place there. And there's folks who help us dealing with the Arctic that's presenting itself in technology development. There's a wide range of activities. Now, obviously, we talked about subsistence tourism, mineral extraction, fishing. Although the fishing is not quite advanced beyond the cold pool of the Bering Straits, eventually it will dissipate. And again, then the Western Arctic will have a fishing aspect similar to the Barents and Norwegian Sea have in the Eastern Arctic. But then, of course, the stage and thinking through the context is that we're in a zone where there is a lot of good collaboration. In the Arctic today, there is remarkable collaboration, perhaps one of the most collaborative zones on the planet. Of course, that is now being seen as more, being cross-latched against more competition, and of course, the opportunity for more contesting. So we've talked a bit about where Russia is in this. The question is, strategically, is Russia acting out of a position of fear to secure their own Arctic coasts, or are they looking for adventures in more Arctic adventuring? Do we know? And the question is, yes. The answer is they're defending what they consider theirs and projecting power and seeing opportunity. Of course, we spoke about China. China is about opportunities by investing and creating they're using their narrative and investing dollars where people will take those dollars, or yen or won, whatever it is, I can't remember. But story short, China is playing as economic leverage and working a comprehensive political narrative that's being taken multinationally. There, as mentioned earlier, lots of non-Arctic states. Well, a non-Arctic state is a non-Arctic state. The idea of a near-Arctic state, I haven't quite figured out what that is in Webster's. I've looked, but I haven't seen, quote, a near-Arctic state. So until Webster's describes it, I'm going to kind of still scratch my cranium on this. Industry, of course, has right reasons to leverage the Arctic for gain. We wish them to be doing it safely, smartly, in a way that minimizes the impact of the environment. Communities, okay? Our Arctic sentinels in the United States are those people who live along the western shores of Alaska, the north shores of Alaska, and our Canadian colleagues in the North American Arctic, and of course our fellow colleagues in Greenland, which still remains as part of Denmark. So those communities and their resilience and their ability to sustain themselves and their presence matters. Illicit actors right now are taking advantage of undergoverned spaces. That's a fact, and I've heard it too many times to not take it seriously. Technology does help all of us if leveraged right. Okay, working two things. I am a pilot, so I can do this. I used to be a pilot. I can't say that anymore, I guess. What are our strategic national interests in the Arctic? Well, since there's not a, quote, hard definition of this in the NSS, I can pull out the U.S. strategic national interest in the Arctic. Number one, it is our citizens who live in the region. It is our U.S. sovereign territory. It's our fisheries, it's our marine mammals, and it's the seafloor where chemicals or petrochemicals are harvested, rare earth minerals, etc., and the attendant ocean environments. It is, of course, our ability to secure the maritime approaches that intend, again, in our national interest. And of course, borders, coasts, and ports. It is in our national interest to seek the preservation of unique and fragile flora and fauna and the Arctic indigenous cultures. Environmental and cultural security do contribute, and they're part of national security. We want to be able to operate quickly across the Arctic in a safe manner. We wish freedom of navigation for friendly nations. We wish safe and coordinated and responsible commercial activities. We want the region free from conflict and confrontation from belligerent nations, and also free from unchecked criminal activities. So with this as a catalyst, or sorry, with that as a backdrop of our national security, what's different now? And obviously we hit this hard, so I won't go in detail. But I will say that in some, a rapidly warming Arctic makes it easier for folks to get there. The threshold to get there is easier. On the maritime spaces, at least seasonally, it doesn't take an icebreaker to get there in lots of places. So with increased human activity, you have both good folks and bad folks. And the question is, do we know the difference? Of course, addressing this, we don't need to go it alone in the Arctic. Okay, we need to think the Arctic as a region of collaboration, and our partners, our allies and partners matter. Working things collaboratively with our allies and partners to reduce our invested costs. Maybe they can help shoulder the burden, specifically we look at folks in the context of a North American Arctic. Let's work this collaboratively where the allies do not go alone in the Arctic. Doesn't make sense, it costs too much, and we won't make it anyway. So, as a result of the catalyst, I view the fact respectfully that the Arctic is replete with vulnerabilities. We've hit on this a bit today. Diminishing ice environment is incentive for increased activity. We're seeing increased tourism, shipping, resource extraction, and of course this will continue to accelerate. The ecosystem, as well as described earlier, is changing, and it impacts the physical environment and the human ecosystems, as well as, of course, the physical Arctic itself. And despite policies and practices that are trying to help keep the Arctic from being militarized, it is at increasing risk of being a zone of competition. Logistics matter in the Arctic. Logistics for response and logistically supporting the responders. It is likely, from my respective vantage point, that Canada, the United States, and our respective NATO's and allies and partners in Europe have really convergent national interests. So let's find a way in the framework to work this in a way that, again, reduces our overall costs. So it is important to relook the Arctic from a security lens in some, and I won't go to the details, but the bottom line, rising activities and great powers in other nations within and without the Arctic are looking to take advantage of this diminished ice environment. It makes sense. And if I saw an article yesterday, so I didn't catch the details, but story short, if 5 Arctic nations were in a race right now for doing more in the Arctic, the United States would be dead last. So the question is, okay, so if we're dead last, who cares? Can we catch up? Well, the question is how fast are the folks running as opposed to how slow we're going? The idea is maybe we can wait. That may be fine. But the question is will we be able to catch up when we need to? And then if we try to catch up, will we have the resources and the energy to do so? Or will we be distracted on something else? I believe in the tent revival construct. So today, we got a lot of religion going on here. But the reality is, Washington, D.C. has a habit of playing kid soccer. Where the ball goes is where the rest of the team follows. So, and I did a lot of kid soccer back in the day. No harm, hope I didn't hurt anyone's feelings by saying that. Strategically, environmental security matters. Presence is less than we need. So I try to describe it down as someone who's a Pentagon recidivist and a lot of time on Joint Staff, it's a lot of time on Joint Staff JA5. Threats, risks, and probabilities. We've hit on the threats. The question is, I don't think today is December 6, 1941 of the new millennium. I don't think so. On the other hand, what are the things that keep it from becoming that in the Arctic? Do we need to see an Arctic contest? I hope not. I don't believe so. I think we need, like Dr. McCoy said, I think we need to be able to respond, but I don't think we need to over-exaggerate the problem set. On the other hand, folks like China, how soon before they pop a well into the Chukchi Sea in the international space? And if they do, then what will happen? The question is, are they, not only one, is that smart to do, and second of all, what sort of environmental catastrophe could they cause? Remember, for our Arctic residents, the sea is their garden. And if those regions become soiled and polluted, then we eliminate those people who live there to conduct subsistence living. And again, you know, will Arctic warming be catastrophic? I don't know. Do we really know what the impacts are? The questions is that we should take it seriously. What if Arctic ecosystems fail? What happens? Will the U.S. loses Arctic residents because people just can't stay there? What if we lose those Arctic sentinels? Well, nature abhors a vacuum. What happens if criminal activities co-opt villages that are not able to take care of themselves in the case of this? My question is, will we act in a responsible way to regain the initiative? And my question is, can we afford not to? So, getting close. So strategically, as a result of great power competition, the probabilities versus the scope of conflict versus the consequence. To me, I agree with what Secretary Mattis is saying. Strategically, it's not a zone of military operation conflict. It's our interest. It's our national interest to prevent it from becoming so. So, in bringing this, a couple of provocative thoughts. Obviously, preserve, protect, and defend matters. This includes defense, safety, law enforcement, environmental security. And there is, in the context of NATO, thinking about what could bad happen up there. That probably wasn't well stated, but remember I got hit on the head a while back, so I'm okay. Are we prepared for a Crimea of the North? My guess is that we're probably not. Have we really thought through it? My guess is that we probably have not. I do know, having worked a lot with former DASD Jim Townsend, that Russia respects strength. I have lots of stories I can tell you about that. Now the question to me is, as we spoke about China in this case, they have a narrative that's working. My question is, should it? My question to you then is that at the end of the day, we should take care of our own business we should defend, secure, and environmentally secure our sovereign territory. Either the Arctic is a priority or not. I know that prevention is always easier than response and it's cheaper. And yes, I recognize that we have a $21 trillion debt. So affordability does matter. So we've got to consider a series of aspects that are coordinated and complementary. And I'll go through those quickly. And you're saying, yeah, he's going through quickly. So again, the slides are available for you afterwards. I've framed this in the context of treaties, legislative, policy, and resources, and those actions that just people can agree to do together. So in this context, I've looked at NATO, NORAD, matter, UNCLOS, just do it. And strategically for us, can we think about those things that advance the ball specifically with NORAD and the Tri-Command framework in the security context? So, legislation, okay? These boils down to authorities. Right now, many security law enforcement types can't do much with each other, and they live in cylinders. And you think about from a Canadian-U.S. vantage point for North Atlantic, we just don't do well at all. We do really well militarily, and we don't do well with law enforcement between borders. We should fix this. We also should take a look at things that affect the Alaska Natives who live there, and it was 1971, a long time ago. And the Alaska Native Settlement Claims Act has been something that's been sitting out there, just done well. And frankly, I think most of Alaska would agree with that. It's time to maybe take a look at it in a diminishing environment as environmental change impacts those people who live there now. Policy matters. Obviously for us, that the Permanent Joint Board of Defense between Canada and the United States is one opportunity that's under strength right now. And it's one way to advance not only the military, but the law enforcement security part of the conversation. And I'm no longer in uniform, so I can say this about a 4-star shooting me. And that is the idea of the Unified Command Plan. Admiral Z, you hit it earlier. I have religion. I'm right on your wing. I couldn't say that when I was in the Pentagon. But it is time to relook the alignment of forces based in Alaska and who their combatant command and OPCON to, respectfully submitted. And then things that strategically matter. Let's bring the conversation where it's, I love the idea of a round table, okay, because we're all peers and it can be family business. Grow a big tent. Strategically, think about an Arctic, U.S. Arctic Leaders Roundtable, a non-hierarchical gathering of federal, state, and Arctic community. And maybe we make a Canadian-U.S. version too. I don't know. Resources, yes, we're constrained. I got it right? Yeah, okay. I would offer, though, that security-focused logistics is way lagging. Our communication sensing is making small gains. The United States Coast Guard, okay, is someone that does a heavy lot of lifting for our Arctic to secure and defend our Arctic interests on the surface. And frankly, they're grossly under strength. You take a look at their mission and you look at their resourcing, and I can say this and get away with this because I'm just a university guy, but strategically our nation should take this more seriously. Our Coast Guard needs to be more properly resourced for the mission that they shoulder for our nation in the Arctic region.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I got religion with Jim, so we'll go with that. And then there's lots of things we can do with no significant preconditions. Just figure out, and this is a framework, and I won't go through the details, but there's a lot we can do that we're not doing right now, and this is the proverbial tip of the iceberg, pun intended. So in sum, Admiral Z saying, I never thought this young man would finish up. It is wise to consider that we're overdue in preserving and protecting our national interests. The question is, are we going to take this seriously? Will we get religion beyond the end of this meeting today? My guess is likely not as much as we should. But if we at least keep moving the ball forward, then maybe we can find some way more to our advantage in the long term. Let's play the Arctic for the long ball. Let's play it comprehensively. Let's find a way to align our efforts so that we're all shooting in collaborative fashion and not shooting each other's target. But remember, everyone has a role to play if we're going to do this right. Other nations take this approach. Whole of nation is not a unique U.S. invention. We don't necessarily do as well as we should. Perhaps we should try this harder. And if we don't bring the state communities together comprehensively, we're going to miss an opportunity. Admiral Z, sir, I spoke too long and said too little, but I'm now finished.
I'll just throw out one question because I really do want to open it up to the audience. And it was a question I would make when I was still wearing uniform, and I would hold these electronic town halls and said, if you were commandant for a day, what is the one thing you would need? And more often than not, they said, well, we need resources. Okay, that doesn't answer the question. What do we need to resource? And they say, well, we want more parking spots at our facility. I said, bad answer, wrong. So I'll throw that back to you. If you were to advise the National Security Council and you had one recommendation to make, with a high probability of that being enacted, what would that one ask look like? And I won't go in any particular order, but if one of you are ready to jump on that, and Church, you had a number of thought provokers on that, so maybe I'll ask you first, and then I'd invite Sherry and Jim to weigh in as well.
Thank you. Well, to be honest with you, sir, the whole discussion is about presence. If we're not able to project presence into secure our maritime approaches on the surface, all seasons, all the time, we yield the initiative to those who do. And so without a serious investment in polar security cutters, we're going to lag the fight no matter how well we do in other areas. Without hard presence, hard capability, and to be able to secure and, again, think Title 10 and Title 14, a polar security cutter that conduct that mission unimpeded in the Arctic would be the one thing I'd ask the National Command authorities. That's what I'd ask for.
Okay, so a genie normally grants 3 wishes.
Oh, thank you.
So, okay, your wish has been granted.
Oh, I'm so
okay,
happy.
so that means you can't ask for the same thing, Sherry. So, how would you answer that question? The one ask with a high probability.
Well, so I'm gonna take that as a given that we've already gotten, the
We're so happy,
investment.
too. We're so happy. We're
in
doing high five.
In the polar security cutters, and we need
And
the
remember,
presence.
it's not just cutters.
With
Right.
plural.
Right. And we need that presence, and we need it sort of integrated across the whole of government. But the foundational elements are one of the foundational elements that we're missing in being able to have presence in the Arctic is the waters are uncharted, and without knowing where we're going to operate. And NOAA, of course, has that mission, and they are one of the more under-resourced of the federal agencies. But I think with the new technologies we have coming online, and with harnessing public-private partnerships and taking a whole-of-government approach, I'd say that's a foundational element to our being able to operate and bring up. We had, as you know, we saw an amphib operating up in Anchorage. Last summer hadn't been up that far, and there was talk of sort of going further, bringing up bigger ships in the future. Well, we need to know, as well as other types of vessels, going to need to know how to operate in that region.
Okay. Well, if we're going to have ships, we need charts. And I'll just digress for a second, because when I did serve at PACOM as the director of GIATF West. We were doing a lot of work in Indonesia. And lo and behold, I found out that through PACOM they had sponsored a domain awareness investment, about a $200 million coastal radar array to detect pirates, and this was before the big tsunami. I was the operator on the ground and saying, well, who is fusing the information, and then what do you do with it? Well, one, they didn't have a fusion center. Two, they didn't have the authorities nor the competencies to act upon the electromagnetic energy that was being propagated into the Straits of Malacca. But we came up with $200 million somewhere with U.S. taxpayer money to go out and put electromagnetic energy in, but we didn't do the end game to go with it as well. So yes, if we're going to have ships, we better have charts. So how we sequence those, I think, are important as well.
Do we get any other wishes?
Well, Jim might
gets to
have
make
one.
his
Yeah,
wish
yeah.
first.
You're not going to take my wish. I know what you're going to say. This is
You're
mine.
going to take my wish before I wish it?
Yes.
Go for it.
You got 20 shopping days remaining.
So I think for me, to my mind, in Washington, the Arctic, whether it's Alaska, whether it's up in the North American, whether it's Europe, it's still a boutique thing in Washington. Whether you're talking to people on the Hill, whether you're talking to people in the Pentagon or at the state, who are here, and I'm very glad the State Department folks are here, and Ambassador Raji got them here, and I appreciate that. It's still too much of a boutique and a bit of a one-off. Icebreakers, a one-off thing for the budget. Everyone's pushing icebreaker. We've got to build within Washington I called it a constituency, but it's got to be a bureaucratic constituency that's got bureaucratic structural change behind it. And what I mean by that is whether it's a UCP. I mean, I would almost say we need to have an Arctic COCOM is what we need. We've got to have a bureaucratic entity that's going to fuse together these priorities, come up with a campaign plan, hit the budget every year on the Hill. We've got to have a bureaucratic driver within the government, and I'm talking about defense and security here. So we've got to have that driving these things, so it's not just a one-off here for the Arctic, a one-off there, and the CNO says, yeah, okay. I mean, even Second Fleet, again, I keep talking about listening to Admiral Lewis. Arctic is part of his portfolio for Second Fleet that he's now standing up, but he didn't talk about it a whole lot, and that might have been just added to his. So we've got to have something that's a driver bureaucratically, or we're always going to be chasing the shiny object, a one-off shiny object here, a one-off there. We've got to have something coordinated, strong, unified, bureaucratically savvy that drives budgets to get us the things that we need. If we don't have that, then we're just going to be doing the boutique one-off here, one-off there.
Presence, charting, constituency. Got it. And I know, Church, you want to get one more in there.
Just please, Santa.
A quick one. A quick one, or else.
Okay. So Admiral, and I hit this earlier, but I was just getting tight on time, so I didn't hit what as hard as I wanted to. So, Jim, I would offer your wish needs to be adjusted a bit. Okay. Because we're not looking for a military solution here. So a unified combatant command for the Arctic is something I think that let's adjust your wish a bit. I think a joint, multinational, multi-agency, interagency, and multinational among the coalition of willing task organization that's focused on Arctic security and in a broader sense makes more sense than a COCOM. Let me finish.
Church, that's what I said.
You said COCOM, my friend. I heard you, and so and I love you dearly, but nonetheless, I do
They're
think
previewing the interagency debate that's going to occur about creating this thing here.
so.
I want the Pentagon in charge of this.
Well, strategically, though, the JIAF South, JIAF West example makes lots of sense.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I expect Dr. Farrell, you remember I said the word JIAF North in May of 2017. I collected a whole lot of spears on the stage. But the idea is it kind of strategically find the right term, but the idea is it should be security focused, and it should really be oriented towards a multi-set of security, environmental security included.
Yep.
Right.
And it enables defense, and so to me, that's how I would address it.
I agree, and it can't be so heavy that bureaucratically just sinks. It's got to be something that that fuses this stuff together, and I agree with exactly what you laid out. That's kind of what I was getting at. I just called it a COCOM, but anyway.
I'm sorry.
All right, so let me turn it to the audience. We have time for several questions. Alice, we'll lead off with you.
I love what you've all been saying, but I'm always pulled back to what I hate to say is the dumbed-down reality of this conversation that requires what we used to call an elevator speech. When somebody says to you, but why does it matter? The answer can't just simply be security. We have a security responsibility in many places in the world. We probably could just fortify the Bering Sea portion of the U.S. coastline without doing much of what's been talked about today. I would love to know what you all who think defense and defensively can come up with the offensive, positive, developmental answer to why it matters.
Okay. Jim, you want to take that one first, since you mentioned the word COCOM?
Afraid you're going to mention that. Number one, I think you're absolutely right, and I will say that when I have spoken out during the course of the day, and when Mike and I talk and Sherry, I always bring the defense and security side to it anyway. So that's just where I come from. Church has done a great job here grabbing that and saying it's more than that. It's much more than that. And the so what has got to be more than defense and security. It's an interesting point because in Washington, that defense and security thing, the Russian, the Chinese, is driving everything. It really does. And it's driving the money. If we're going to pitch for an icebreaker, we're going to call it a cutter and say it can carry weapons. And then all of a sudden people are starting to listen. And then you paint the Russians as 10 feet tall to scare everyone. Then you get your money. And so security and defense becomes the driver. And that's wrong because it becomes the driver, but it also creates these impressions that whether the Russians are 10 feet tall or that other problems, particularly in the Alaskan Arctic, don't matter, whether it's environmental or climate change or all those kinds of things. Those little buds, they wither and die in the great shadow of the oak, which is all security and defense. And so that's wrong. I think I heard enough today where I can sit down and give a more holistic view of why it's important and the role that security and defense play, which is just over here. But right now in this town, it's a feature of Washington. It's a feature of current events, the Russians, the Chinese, the Silk Road, et cetera, et cetera. And it just seems to play well in the Congress that we've had to deal with now in the past, which is changing, where if you paint it in defense and security issues, you're closer to getting what you want. And also, the military is there. They always deliver. So if you can turn something into a military problem, like our border in the Southwest, we're going to deploy troops down there, that makes you feel good because you can get the guys down there and they're gonna deliver the goods because that's what the military does. But you're masking the magnitude and the nuance of the problem. So I think you're absolutely right. And so I've sat here and I've admired the problem for you and I've scoped out where I am. But how to fix that, I don't know. But I think it's closer to what Church was just saying about my COCOM idea into something else.
Yeah, and I will just say that security has second-order effects, and prosperity is a big component of that.
I do think we have to be able to walk and chew gum in this region. We have to be able to talk about great power competition and Arctic climate change in the same sentence, because they're both happening. And I thought Shannon's slide did a very good job with the 3 circles earlier, to show that national security has various dimensions. It's sovereignty, and it's all the things we think of in terms of military presence. It's also stewardship of the resources that are so foundational, from the fish to the ecosystems to the biodiversity, and then it's the safety and the human dimensions and resilience. And we have to be able to tell, and it's the people of the Arctic, and you know that yourself quite well. And, the near-term risks that I think we are unprepared for are an oil spill in the Arctic, which could be much worse than the Exxon Valdez accident, or a search and rescue incident. And, Admiral Z and others have talked about, we're upping our ability to deal with that, but there are a lot of risks. There are a lot of different cases and scenarios that you could posit where a ship is in trouble or people are at risk that we will not be able, just with Coast Guard and local assets to rescue. And so we're not building a military capability to do that, but the military will be sort of the reach back capability in some of those situations. And then I think we have with the great power competition in the region becomes this possibility of miscalculation. We didn't anticipate what was happening in Crimea and Ukraine and those incursions. And we're, the story about what is this illicit trafficking on our own borders in the region is still not well understood and well told. Not well told probably for very good reasons, but at the same time, we have to be prepared to defend against those risks as well.
Yeah. Church.
In 1867, the United States became an Arctic nation. We reaffirmed our commitment as an Arctic nation in 1959. In the Constitution's preamble, we talk about providing for the common defense and supporting the general welfare. If, in fact, as our Arctic residents are included under that umbrella of our Constitution, that's why this matters, to defend our citizens, defend our territory, and to provide for the general welfare. So to me, this is we are United States as an Arctic nation. We need to take these Arctic responsibilities seriously. If we don't, frankly, I shudder to think who could take advantage of our lack of action and our lack of interest.
It was 104 years ago when Titanic went down. At that very point in time, we were going to disestablish the United States Coast Guard. We were actually called the Revenue Cutter Service at the time. And then with the loss of life, we need a Coast Guard. Not only that, we need an international ice patrol. And so to this day, 104 years later, we are still flying the International Ice Patrol out of Greenland. But it took one of those black swan events to wake up to the fact that we operate in a cold water domain and we didn't have the capacity to respond. So I think we heard a lot today, some great thoughts, some great ideas, but what is it going to take, to not just kick the can down the road, but really get the vehicle on the road and let's get moving down the track. So that's one of my takeaways. If there's a couple of common themes that I've heard is what is the strategic narrative on the Arctic? What is it that's going to sell the bureaucracy, if you will, that this is an area that we need to prioritize, we need to invest in, and these are the near-term investments that we need to make. And so when you start looking at that, what is the command and control structure for the Arctic? We've bounced some ideas around. It clearly needs to be more about just security. It needs to be science-informed. But if you're going to stand this up, if you stand up any campaign, the first thing you need to do is what are your assumptions? And more often than not, a plan will fail if you don't get the assumptions right in the first place. And many times we like to plan for the best case. And we don't really plan for the worst case scenarios. But what are the assumptions? The strategic narrative, and here are the assumptions going forward. And the assumptions really need to be global in their view. And they also need to be very skeptical in terms of our ability to resource. We've got an aging population. We've got a $21 trillion debt that we're servicing. In fact, to pay the interest on that debt alone within the next several years will exceed the appropriation for the Pentagon. It's going to be about $840 billion a year in interest, and it's going to go up over time. So that's a very real threat that's out there as well. So, I think that's just something that we need to plan on. And then if you're going to plan, three simple strands that you need to weave together: ends, means, and ways. And we really need to define what the end state needs to be, and it really goes back to those assumptions. And then the ways and the means is really the resource piece to get there. And it may come down to what can we afford to do. And if it comes down to what can we afford to do, it gets back to Church's piece up there. What are the risks that we are willing to accept? And we need to be transparent about those risks going forward. When I was asked to testify about what would happen if Shell had a major oil spill up in the Arctic, I said, first of all, a major oil spill may be 15 barrels of oil, because we don't know what the long-term effects would be on the ecosystem up there, which is absolutely pristine. We don't know. Rather than say we're the Coast Guard, we're always ready. We knew that during Deepwater Horizon, we had 47,000 responders. I had 6,000 vessels out there. But on any day that the seas were over 4 feet, we couldn't recover any oil. It was too rough. You pray for 4-foot seas up in the Arctic. It's not going to happen. It's going to fail. And then what do you do about that? And so I think we need to be very frank and honest about what some of those assumptions, those vulnerabilities are going forward. And then at the end of the day, what risk are we willing to write off in a resource-constrained environment?
Well, that was a really interesting look forward. Lots of work ahead.
Lots of work ahead, but really great insights from 4 individuals who have worked in this environment for a very long time. I think it complements all the other work done throughout the series as well.
Mike, well, thank you for joining us for this series and for your work in making it all possible. Thank you as well. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll tune in for other episodes if this is the first that you've had a chance to catch, or if it's the last and you've been with us for all 5. We thank you for joining us. And if you'd like more information, come to wilsoncenter.org on this topic and many others. We have a wealth of information, and we want you to be not only informed but involved in these issues. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center and for Mike Sfraga, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.